Hey, it's Jordan. I am delighted to be joined by Robert Crutel and Leslie Pacey. Robert, you have worked for many, many years as a contractor for the EPA, handling airborne flights, among other things, detecting chemical contamination for the EPA. And Leslie, you are with the Government Accountability Project. You're an environmental investigator. And I think, Robert, first of all, compliments to you. I have spoken to many off the record folks in the EPA over the years that are concerned with things they see, but for various reasons don't go forward. So thank you to you for coming forward and blowing the whistle on some really concerning things regarding the derailment of Norfolk Southern's train in East Palestine and the, in my view, unnecessary detonation of toxic chemicals over East Palestine and Western Pennsylvania that happened afterward. So first, Robert, I'd like to ask if you could just explain for the audience your background, what it is you do as a contractor for the EPA, and a little bit about the planes that you work with that fly over disaster areas like East Palestine.
Oh, yes, I'd be very happy to do it. I was the program manager in Department of Defense when we first started developing this technology in 1984. And we tried to develop this technology to see if we could detect chemicals from an airplane and the chemicals being on the ground. After 9/11, the director of EPA, Christy Todd Whitman, immediately transferred this program and technology to the EPA because they were worried about getting hit by chemicals or terrorist attacks. After 9/11, immediately after 9/11, we basically thought that there's a possibility we could get hit by chemical weapons or something nefarious in the government. The US EPA at the time had all their equipment on trucks, and they were in Edison, New Jersey, and all the bridges were closed, and they could not get any chemical sensors in downtown Manhattan to do any kind of monitoring to determine what the hazards were. And so the afternoon of 9/11, she called us up in the Department of the Army. I was working for the Department of the Army at the time, and transitioned this equipment and technology over to the EPA that afternoon. And since then, afterwards, EPA asked me to work for them to help continue the development of this particular technology. We have one airplane for the whole United States. It's Dallas, Texas. It is supposed to respond within an hour after being called out, and it has made 180 emergency response measurements missions since 9/11. So the program got started in 2001, and it's continued to this day. And EPA uses it on all the large chemical plant fires or train car derailments. EPA uses this particular aircraft. It's the one in the nation. It's got the best technology that this country offers for that aircraft. That equipment is highly maintained, and it's at ready in a moment's notice to go out to any town.
So let me ask you, in your experience, the derailment of Norfolk Southern's rail cars in East Palestine happened on the evening, Friday evening, February 3rd last year. about 9 o'clock. You know, first responders didn't immediately know that there were hazardous chemicals on there, but within a few hours they did. In the normal process, how quickly would you be contacted, and that one plane, which has state-of-the-art sensors to detect chemicals, what would the typical process be that you would expect that plane to be contacted and fly over a site like East Palestine?
Well, we did expect within 5 minutes that somebody at the EPA that was dealing with that at the time would pick up the phone and deployed the plane to the site. So that would take about 5 minutes that we need this airplane. There's obviously a big problem and we need to get it up to East Palestine as quickly as possible. Then the airplane takes about, EPA advertises that its wheels up within 1 hour. Their contract calls for the contractor to be available to have it off the ground within 1 hour of notification. The pilots and operators live down the street from the hangar, so they just run over from their houses to the hangar immediately. So typically there's no delay. It's about 1 hour. And then this airplane is fairly slow, the one EPA has decided to implement, and it takes about 5 hours to get up to East Palestine.
And when
on the web EPA had, yeah, go ahead.
When were you, the contractors, contacted after the derailment on Friday night, and when did the plane first get up over East Palestine?
Well, we weren't contacted that they were even considering a mission till at least Monday in February. So February 3rd was on a Friday night, and the plane was actually called in by EPA Sunday afternoon, mid-afternoon, and then it took them a long time to ready the plane for flight. But the plane did leave the ground in Dallas 3 minutes before midnight on the 5th. The plane flew up to East Palestine, landed. They based out of Pittsburgh. The typical operation is that the plane would make an immediate pass over East Palestine as soon as they got there, and make a couple of passes. Although the pilots are tired, they could make a couple of passes over the aircraft that night. It would be February 6th, and it was in the morning. The weather was fine when they came in, and they could have done that. For some reason, they didn't do that. And then the weather was bad on February 6th, or EPA claims there was some potential of icing. They could not fly, even though there was other aircraft there that were flying. For some reason, this aircraft they decided was going to be affected more than some of the other aircraft. And so they elected not to fly it at all on the 6th. And then they finally did get it up on the February 7th. And the first data I had was February 7th, midday. And we can analyze the data within 30 seconds of it making a pass. We have satellite communications on this aircraft, and it can look at we can log into the computers on the airplane, and we can analyze the data on the airplane almost immediately after they collect data. So my contention is that EPA delayed this response so long that it was essentially, it's when I had data, it's 5 days. And so EPA is now coming back and saying, well, they deployed it 2 days. Well, Before I had data, it was 5 days before anybody in the country had.
The EPA is saying they deployed it 2 days after the derailment.
Yeah, and in their statements, but I'm a data scientist. When did I first get data? It was 5 days late. And that is not typical from any mission that's ever occurred in the history of the Aspect program.
So the timeline here is very important, and Leslie, feel free to jump in too. To me, something doesn't seem right if the EPA and Norfolk Southern, why Norfolk Southern was controlling the emergency response, I still don't know, but put that aside. If the concern on Saturday, so 24 hours after the derailment, on Sunday, 48 hours, is of potentially an uncontrolled explosion of these train cars carrying vinyl chloride, that is what Norfolk Southern claimed was the concern. Your technology, the plane's technology, better than any human on the ground, could detect how hot or cool those cars were, and whether would be the best measurement of whether there was a concern for an uncontrolled explosion. So why wouldn't the EPA have immediately dispatched the plane over to get real-time data on the temperatures of those cars and, most importantly, what chemicals were already in the air?
Leslie, you want to answer that? I mean, we're as scientists, we're astonished that that would happen. And it's never happened in the history of the Aspect program. Leslie?
Yeah, I would like to just say that, yeah, like Robert was saying, it's highly unusual, right, for them to not deploy within, be at a certain disaster location within about an hour or several hours, rather. Certainly it's crazy that it didn't happen the next day or the next day or the next day. And it ended up being 5 full days before they gathered this data. This was so important that they did get out there early, and Robert and his colleagues really pushed the EPA to do so. But there was no response there. But they should have gotten out there early, because you think about this, the first 4 days of this disaster, up through when they decided to detonate all these vinyl chloride tank cars, there was an active chemical threat. Actually, scientists that I've spoken with said that those first 4 days before the detonation were about 10 times more dangerous in terms of the chemicals that were being released. This is largely not talked about in the media, but the residents there, and they were being exposed to a lazy fire of vinyl chloride chemicals and dioxins and a number of other chemical mixtures that were already burning. Why would you not put the airplane in the sky so that it could, inform decisions on the ground for first responders, for residents, for evacuations, when to lift those, properly lift those evacuations? So they didn't do that. Why, we don't know. It seems very suspicious, but why did they not do that? Why did they break protocol during, the biggest chemical bomb disaster in the United States? Why now?
I'm sorry to interrupt, but wouldn't this have been helpful also if the plane was up sooner, to be able to see maybe the evacuation zone needs to be longer than 1 mile? Exactly. Maybe you could see that these chemicals are going far past 1 mile, because we know it went into Pennsylvania, among other areas.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That would be a question for Robert on the chemicals and the ability for the aircraft.
Yeah, the chemicals, we have basically 78 chemicals we can identify immediately off the aircraft. We have artificial intelligence algorithms that I've been part of that development. We have developed we have a very senior set of scientists, world-class scientists that are actually working on this. And they've developed, we have, as a group, have developed these algorithms and we published many articles in the peer-reviewed journals about it. we can detect these chemical compounds from the aircraft automatically. However, all of our scientists, we're old guys. We don't believe 100% in artificial intelligence. We like to look at the spectra ourselves. We're no nonsense chemical infrared spectroscopists with I have 40 years experience. The other guys have 30 years, over 30 years experience. And we like to look at the spectra themselves and verify independently what's actually in the plume that we're looking at. So it's a combination of viewing high technology, automated algorithms, which only assist the infrared spectroscopists, and we put a very senior spectroscopist to actually review every spectra. To, you know, what we're trying to do is assure the first responders and the public that what thing is valid. There's extensive QA, QC. The quality control is a big amount of effort that we put on this particular data from the aircraft.
And to be clear, the EPA is claiming that the flight occurred 2 days after, but the flight actually occurred on February 7th, which was the day after they detonated these cars, correct?
Yeah.
Well, I think the EPA is saying that they deployed the flight or they requested the flight 2 days after, but they actually admit in their reports that the flight was only done, 2 flights were done on the 7th.
Right.
The issue here is, you know, they missed their there's hotspots, right, for these chemicals, and there's a window of opportunity for this aircraft and its technology to pick up the chemicals. And they completely missed that window of opportunity. And they had foreknowledge of the phosgene that would be created and the vinyl chloride that they would have been able to detect on February 6th through emails with the company that Robert worked for and is now retired from. He retired over his frustration, mainly with this situation. But there were emails telling the program manager for the EPA aspect aircraft that you will see mostly phosgene, which is a chemical weapon banned in World War I. And it's a product of incomplete combustion like dioxin is. And you will also see vinyl chloride. So the EPA had foreknowledge that they would collect this data and still chose not to fly the aircraft. And they missed the first few days of the lazy fire. They missed the big plume, which would have been ideal for gathering data for the chemicals that were involved in this disaster. And you were saying earlier something about the train cars and the decision made by basically Norfolk Southern and its contractors pushing the state of Ohio governor and the fire chief saying, you've got 13 minutes to make a decision here. These train cars look like they're polymerizing. Well, we now know from NTSB that that was not the case. These train cars were actually cooling. But EPA had its best technology sitting on the ground that could have flown over any time before that detonation and determined the train cars were cooling and not in danger of catastrophic explosion. The EPA, it's their responsibility to protect human health and the environment, yet they didn't use their best technology to prevent making a disaster even worse. So that doesn't look good at all for the EPA and what they're doing.
And Robert, I want to also ask the stories that came out this week on what you're revealing. It's not only that the flight was delayed when the aspect plane flew over. Could you describe? Apparently, the chemical sensors were turned off at some points.
Yes, at some points it was turned off. We never heard of that as scientists. It was turned off going up the creeks. Little Beaver Creek, when we were scanning that, they turned off the chemical sensors. We have not heard from EPA as to why that happened. We did ask them on a Teams call during the event, like, do you really want to, with a question, do you really want to do that? Turn off the sensors while we're going up Beaver Creek? They did consider that a photo reconnaissance mission and not a chemical priority, but there were millions of gallons going into the river. I question that.
Two questions. One, the actual flight, is that EPA officials flying that plane?
No, it's a contractor flying that plane, but EPA is directing it.
Okay.
There's an official at EPA on the ground directing the airplane location.
So the direction to turn off the sensors is coming from the EPA?
Yes.
And secondly, it's a state-of-the-art plane with state-of-the-art chemical sensors, and they're telling you that the point of the mission was not chemical detection, but photo reconnaissance?
They told us that it was photo reconnaissance. The priority was photo reconnaissance over the creeks.
I mean, you don't need to be a physicist, a chemist. That doesn't make a lot of sense.
It didn't make any sense to us, but
you've never heard in all of these years that they would turn off the sensors over certain points?
We never turned off sensors during a mission in 180 missions since goes back to 2001.
And Leslie, I mean, Robert's obviously going to stick with data. I will say, this kind of sounds like you can't find what you don't look for. I mean, the only reason that I could think of that you would turn off the sensors is because you don't want to receive certain data.
It sure looks like that. I mean, we can't get into their heads of what they were thinking or who told them to do what when, but we do know that the program director for EPA did instruct the contractor that was operating the aircraft to turn off the sensors over all the creeks. And we also do know, and you know from your reporting on this, that the creeks have been highly contaminated since day one of this derailment. They actually turned a different color towards the Ohio River, actually ran yellow around the 7th. So it was visible from the air for sure. We have drone footage showing that there was a great deal of contamination in the creeks. In my opinion, in other scientific people's opinion, that you had some hot spots here, right? You had the plume, which are these gaseous vapors that the aircraft could have detected. But after all that was cleared, you had the creeks. Those were your hot spots. That is where all these chemicals were running down Sulphur Run, Leslie Run, and Little Beaver Creek, and out into the Ohio River, which is a drinking water source for millions of Americans. So, it was clear to people on the ground. I'm sure it was clear to Region 5 that this was a contamination problem. And it's been clear through just the testing that's been done by independent scientists like Scott Smith, Three Rivers Waterkeeper, and other groups that the creeks are still contaminated. The residents have been in these creeks taking video footage and posting them online throughout over a year now. We still have a contamination problem in the creeks. So,
and I could tell you I was just there like 2 weeks ago. I was at Christy Ferguson's home because people their homes are over this creek. Just standing on the porch, I felt significant pressure under my eye. The smell is significant. Mm-hmm. And then I walked into her house, which fortunately she's temporarily relocated. I mean, I could only stand 30 seconds. The smell is overwhelming, mm-hmm. Yet the EPA right now is not willing to do indoor air testing. So again, I don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah. The creeks are a main pathway of exposure for a lot of these residents. They run alongside homes. They run underneath homes and basements and buildings. There's a ton of vapor intrusion going on, and it really hasn't been effectively cleaned up yet. So, I mean, that's a fact. We know the creeks are contaminated. They were contaminated from the get-go because they intersect with the rail line where this disaster occurred. And so it just looks highly suspect to turn sensors off over creeks so that you wouldn't be able to pick up these chemicals. I don't know how else you would explain it. And I've been sick too there, by the way. I've been there 3 times. Every time I go, I get sick. Every time I talk to a reporter, they get sick when they go. And I apologize for that. Hold on. I'm on a call. Can't talk. Sorry.
No problem.
I have Signal, so people call me and it comes through my phone, through my
No problem.
computer. So yeah. So I mean, like.
Well, we also know that the CDC workers got sick being there. They didn't publicly tell anyone. I think we found out through Freedom of Information, but CDC workers on the ground left because they were sick.
Right. And, and the first time I was there, it was like 6 months after the derailment. And I was 5 minutes outside of a truck right on Taggart Road or Taggart Street. And I immediately got sick. I had sore throat, scratchy throat. I had a headache. I felt like I was going to pass out. My lips started tingling and I had a metallic taste in my mouth. Other times I've gone, I felt real lightheaded and more sore throat stuff. And then the last time I went, my teeth hurt. My gums and teeth hurt for 2 weeks. And I hear that from the residents a lot. So this is a really real contamination site. It's continuing. It's not better. I hear stories all the time from residents that they're having new seizures. There's having multiple rashes. I mean, they have like waves.
Well, I will just show you. I just interviewed a 18-year-old girl, perfectly healthy before all this, suddenly having seizures. I'll play some of this so viewers can understand what you're talking about.
So then I got transported to another hospital in Youngstown. They can't find anything else in the hospital for a week. And then they sent me home with seizure medicine. That's all they could do. No answers. Like I said, they don't test you for chemicals or anything like that. I mean, I had everything done possible at the hospital, and they still can't find nothing, but I'm still having seizures. Right now, the people just came, and I had to have this wrapped around my head. It's a EEG. A 3-day EEG, which I already did it at the hospital. I have to do it again to make sure everything's okay, to see, if there's something else. And then after this, I have to have this on for 3 days. And then after this, I have to go to the Cleveland hospital and stay there for another week and be made a fool again.
And that does not look very comfortable, what you have wrapped around your head.
It hurts.
It hurts?
Yeah. Really bad.
And she gets headaches. Tell them how you feel sometimes, especially when the weather's bad.
Yeah, and just looking like this is just...
So that's just one girl. I mean, people could say, well, you can't do cause and effect. She's not the only one. I mean, there's widespread health issues. And the EPA, it kind of reminds me of Flint because I've been covering that for years. The EPA, the city, the state told the people of Flint, don't believe your brown water, don't believe your rashes, don't believe your hair loss. And we're seeing similar things in terms of health problems. But the EPA is claiming, well, our testing shows everything's fine. Robert, I want to ask you also, we have the delayed flight. We have turning off sensors. There was also an issue where there was a request to draw up flight paperwork after the fact and then backdate the time that the date or time that the aircraft was flown?
Yes. So generally, when we do a mission, we have something called a quality assurance project plan. And that's a plan that allows the data scientists to understand what the goals and the requirements for the data from the EPA are. So it's very useful in planning. We did not have that document, and it was requested by us on February 28th for the contractor to develop. And that's an odd request because generally it's the government's responsibility to write that quality assurance data plan, but apparently they didn't have the understanding or capability to write it or knowledge. And so they requested us to write it. And I think there was a request to backdate it. So, with the program manager, it was asked why you were doing that, and her boss needed it. I assume her boss thought she had it from day one, but she didn't. So that was kind of what happened. She told us to backdate it. So we thought that was highly unusual.
That person was from the EPA?
Yes. We thought that was highly unusual to take a quality assurance data plan and develop it 28 days later, and then try to use it in a submission to a FOIA.
And did they ask you to backdate it to a certain date, or what was?
I'm not sure exactly what was requested, but
Okay.
The problem, they did not have a QAP. They didn't have a SOP. That's called a standard operating procedures. We're still trying to understand and get that. Leslie is following FOIA today to try to get that, how were they operating the equipment up in the airplane? We've not been told. And it's kind of hard when you're the data scientist to not even know how the data was collected. So that's the issue with that particular thing. And then we don't have.
Can I just ask you? We know that the flight was delayed, missing a critical window, maybe the only window to really see the full extent of chemical exposure, but then they turned off the sensors flying over creeks. There was only 8 minutes of data. So can the people of East Palestine even trust the data that was collected?
Well, the data over 8 minutes, they can trust that. So all we can tell you is that we know for a fact they may have flown this upwind. I don't know, but we have data for that 8 minute period of time on February 7th. But we can't tell you what happened February 6th, 5th, or 4th, or 3rd.
And what did the data in that 8 minutes
What's
indicate?
that?
The 8 minutes worth of data, what did that indicate?
It indicated basically we had incomplete combustion. We are seeing smog, compounds from smog and ozone.
Gotcha. Leslie, I'm not going to ask Robert this because obviously he's a data scientist and we'll stick with what we know. But I got to tell you, if it quacks like a cover-up, there does not seem to be legitimate explanations for why we're talking this was used after 9/11, this technology, this plane. So obviously, when it's a priority for the government to understand real-time chemical exposure or real-time chemical threats, they will deploy it immediately. The only reason, and I wouldn't be saying this unless we had other evidence that the EPA has frankly lied after this incident. We've broken. I'll show this real quick. But when an EPA official was being recorded, he wasn't aware he was being recorded. He acknowledged that this was not a quote controlled burn, which was always kind of laughable. You can't really detonate 5 cars of toxic carcinogenic gas in a controlled manner. He admitted, not knowing he was being recorded, that this was an open burn, which by the EPA's own regulations is prohibited.
So, you know how last week I brought up the thing about that being an open burn? And you said that it was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could, yeah. So what I said was, yes, you can consider that an open burn.
Okay.
Right? No, but in an emergency situation, it is what it is.
Then I printed this out from I don't know where it's from.
So he goes longer there, but people tell the truth when they don't know they're being recorded. I want to ask, and Robert, if you have thoughts, feel free to jump in. What always didn't make sense to me here, why was Norfolk Southern controlling the emergency response? the EPA was on the ground right away. So the EPA was there, and we have found out from the owner of the chemical car company, a year ago we found this out, that the owner of the chemical car company repeatedly was telling Norfolk Southern, advising Norfolk Southern that there is no risk of an uncontrolled explosion. The EPA was part of those conversations. That the temperatures of the cars are cooling. There's no, they're not polymerizing in technical speak. And you don't need to detonate the cars. So why was Norfolk Southern controlling the emergency response? Robert, in your experience, because you've had this flight, 118 times, you said, is it typical?
180.
Okay, 180. Is it typical that the company would be in control of the emergency response rather than an EPA on the ground?
I've never seen it. I'm not really responsible for that element of the response, but typically we talk to incident commander, who's a government person, or like a local first responder, or a fire chief that's really controlling the response.
So, Leslie, I played that clip because I think there's a key phrase Mark Durno used. He said, in an emergency situation, it is what it is. But we know this was not, obviously this is an emergency, the train derailed. But we know that this was not an emergency in terms of there was no risk of an uncontrolled explosion. So the EPA official, who, by the way, was the EPA's cleanup guy in Flint, didn't do such a good job. He's acknowledging that this was an open burn, which is against the EPA's regulations dating back to the 1980s. But there wasn't an emergency for this to happen because the temperatures were cooling. And we have all this, thanks to Robert, all this compounding evidence that they were doing highly suspect things like turning off sensors, delaying flights, requests to backdate the time. Mm-hmm. What does that say other than either the EPA allowed the railroad company to put in motion a cover-up, or the EPA was at best incompetent?
I think the EPA here prioritized Norfolk Southern's bottom line in getting this rail line open, and didn't prioritize the residents' health. And is that because of money and power and lobbying and connections in Washington? I don't know. Could be. They have a lot of that. But that was the priority, to get the rail line fully operational, to get these cars moved out as quickly as possible. A burn was beneficial for the railroad. So I'm just not sure why, but they made all these decisions, and now we have sick kids with seizures and many other problems. And in the United States of America, you would expect more from agencies that we pay to help us and protect our environment and our families. You'd expect more.
And also, Leslie, there's just from start to now, it's one, if you want to be kind to the EPA, abnormality or unusual thing, but they delayed the request for this plane, which can be deployed within a few hours. They, from the ground, are telling them turn off the sensors over the creeks. Okay. Then Norfolk Southern buried contaminated soil right after this derailment. It was only the residents kicking and screaming about this that the EPA basically told them you need to unbury that contaminated soil and remove it properly. So we know right away Norfolk Southern was trying to conceal contamination. Then you have the EPA would not test for dioxins. My recollection, for weeks.
Right.
It was the residents and independent researchers and testers demanding they test for dioxins.
Right.
Independent testers found very high levels of dioxins. For those that don't know, dioxins are highly toxic chemicals. There have been whole communities evacuated in America due to dioxins. Times Beach, Missouri, back in the 1980s, had a crisis, and that's a ghost town now. It was evacuated after high levels of dioxins were found. So it just seems to me, this isn't my opinion, it's just fact after fact, abnormality after abnormality.
Right.
The EPA chose to conceal or not look, and the proof is in the pudding. I mean, Robert, not that you're a chemist, but
Well, I'm a PhD chemist.
then you are. Strike that from the record.
Yeah.
It never made sense to me. How do you blow up 5 cars, I believe over 100,000 gallons of toxic vinyl chloride, and it just stops within a mile marker, and testing shows no vinyl chloride? The testing that they've used, first of all, Norfolk Southern was using a contractor that is known to fudge data dating back to the BP Gulf spill. But how does those chemicals just magically disappear, but the residents are having health symptoms? It just, common sense doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And I'll let Robert chime in if he wants on this one. But, you know, bear in mind, the EPA was not consulting with their own dioxin experts in the beginning of all this. They kept saying nothing to see here. It was only after a congressional hearing in early March that Deborah Shore acquiesced and said, well, we'll test for dioxins because the community wants it. But, you know, EPA had buried documents on their own website that showed they'd done waste sampling of the derailment site, as you probably know by now, that showed with Arcadis, which was the railroad's contractor, they did composite sampling, which means they took 2 samples or various samples and put them together. So the numbers could be quite higher, but their own numbers showed the waste had 19 times higher dioxin than EPA's own actionable levels. So they were well aware weeks before they officially came out and tested for dioxins that was an issue in the community and could very, very well needed to be tested for. So they've just not been transparent from the beginning.
And I'd also like to play this clip again from Mark Durno. Was not aware he was being recorded, and I'm not trying to gang up on him because he's not the head of the EPA, but he didn't know he was being recorded, and in that moment, he also tells some truth that is very, very inconsistent with the EPA's public statements.
My question has always been why 5?
Yeah, why 5?
Because 4 of them were bent perfectly fine.
4 of them, the way I understand it from our guys who were on site, is that 4 of them were not showing signs of stress yet. 1 was, and 1 was getting close.
Was that one?
So
in
why?
the 4th?
And then we had 2 burn pits, right? So
Right.
that tells me that, let's say 1 could influence 1 or 2 others. Then what about the other 2?
Have you guys felt any fluid at
those are.
So, Robert, I ask, obviously the plane was not flown over East Palestine before the decision to detonate them were made, but you're a chemist. We've now learned later, even the 1 car of concern that they said, Norfolk Southern and the EPA said there was a concern that this could explode uncontrolled, that the temperatures were cooling. And it went from, we're concerned about 1 car to now, snap of the finger, we got to blow up 4 others. But even that EPA official is asking why blow up 4 other cars.
Well, all I can say that if I was in charge, I would have this airplane fly over the tank cars, and it's been demonstrated to make measurements over the tank cars in the past. Demonstrated in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, the large train derailment. They had the same situation in Shepherdsville, Kentucky, a number of years ago. And we use this aircraft to actually fly over the tank, chemical tanks, and determine if there was polymerization in the tanks, of materials in the tanks by the heat signature. And we also did use this aircraft during Hurricane Katrina. There's a lot of rail cars that had been sitting there a long time, and they suspected polymerization of materials. And we flew over that and used the sensor to determine what the hazard and risk was. but it wasn't used here.
And
Why? No.
Can I just ask you from a 360-degree angle, how long did you work in this industry and work with the EPA?
Well, my total service in the government was 40 years.
In your total service, specifically dealing with this plane and this, chemical disasters, have you ever seen a response like this that has so many abnormalities?
No, I've never seen anything run this with this many questionable decisions. It's mind-boggling.
Too, I want to say, bear in mind too that the program director for EPA Aspect in a Teams call told the contractors to keep the words East Palestine out of its emails. So they definitely did not want any of this conveyed to media people like yourself. And, why would you tell people to keep the words East Palestine out of your emails?
And can I ask you, Leslie, behind the scenes, for viewers that don't know, just normal everyday Americans as well as journalists could put in freedom of information requests to government agencies to get documents and communications. A lot of times those governments stall or lie, but that's a different story. Can you take us through the process? Has the EPA been forthcoming in releasing communications and documents after this response, or has it been a kind of battle to get information?
Well, it's getting a little bit better, but in the very beginning, when we did our first Freedom of Information Act to the EPA regarding East Palestine, we were specifically looking for information about dioxins and about independent scientist Scott Smith, because he was there and he was finding the dioxins, and they were pretty high levels and a good percentage of the properties there. And we, for the first time in 47 years, as Government Accountability Project was formed, we were denied a fee waiver. We were also denied an expedited processing request. We had contended that we needed this information expedited because of the public health threats that we knew existed. So we ended up having to sue the EPA to expedite processing of that first public records request, and we received expedited processing.
Two more questions, Robert. One, obviously you're not like a medical doctor, but
I'm a chemist.
Okay, a chemist. Is it possible 14 months or now 15 months later that there are still a lot of these chemicals and byproducts of the vinyl chloride being detonated still in the air, still in the water, still in the soil in East Palestine that could be causing these health symptoms?
It's possible.
I will say this to add to, sorry if I cut you off, Robert.
No, go ahead.
I will say this, that the creeks that we discussed earlier and the contamination is actually getting worse. Between Scott Smith and Three Rivers Waterkeeper, there is a timeline of, I want to say, over almost about a year of testing. And what we're finding is that the PAHs and the VOCs are getting worse. A lot of carcinogens in the water. And we attribute that primarily to the weather events, where the train derailment site is washing the chemicals into the creeks even more so and flooding the banks, which is a definite health threat for the residents, but also just the general remediation process of digging up the chemicals at the derailment site and then it going into the creeks there again. So we're seeing actually increased contamination of certain chemicals in the creeks.
And my last question, and both of you could weigh in if you want. To me, this seems very simple. There seems to be a cover-up. I don't know when it started, but I would say hours after that derailment, abnormalities happened, because it doesn't make sense why the multi-billion-dollar railroad company would be in charge of the response. But putting that aside, in the meantime, what do residents need to know? Should they be evacuated by the government? Obviously, certain residents, if they would like to stay, that's up to them. But for residents that would like to be evacuated or would like to be relocated permanently, should the government be footing that bill? Should the government force Norfolk Southern to do so? And since you are with the Government Accountability Project, keyword accountability, I have reached out to Senator J.D. Vance. I have reached out to Senator Sherrod Brown. I have reached out to Senators John Fetterman, Senator Bob Casey, Governor Mike DeWine, Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost, a couple others. And I've asked a very simple question. In light of new evidence, particularly the chair of the National Transportation Board saying Norfolk Southern was repeatedly advised not to do this, not to blow up these cars, and Norfolk Southern hid from Governor DeWine and the fire chief that they were being advised by the chemical car company not to blow out these cars. Should there be a criminal investigation into Norfolk Southern? There's only one person that got back to me, Senator Brown, and didn't even answer that. Just gave me some bumper sticker, theory. Shouldn't there be a criminal investigation? I mean, there's talks of a criminal investigation into Boeing, rightly so. But shouldn't there be a criminal investigation not only into Norfolk Southern, but any EPA officials that were involved with this?
I think so, because we have people actively still getting sick. We have independent scientists that are showing increases of chemicals and dangerous hotspots of dioxin and other VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And we have whistleblowers like Robert, who so heroically came forward to show that things were done improperly. And you have a tremendous disaster that was made worse by our government and the responsible party. There needs to be a criminal investigation, in my opinion. And to answer your other question, I don't think residents are safe there. I think this should be declared a Superfund site, that it should be a disaster declaration so that people can't afford to get out. Even the people that aren't poor or don't have the money to buy a new home, it puts a tremendous strain on them. One family has 40 acres of property and horses and a huge homestead, and it's paid for. Who is going to buy their home? They've got, chemicals in their drinking water and they're showering with this stuff. Who's going to buy their home? How are they going to afford to start all over again in their 40s and 50s? This is something that, our government needs to stand up and say, yes, there's a problem. Yes, these people, err on the side of caution like they did with 9/11 victims, burn pit victims, and say these people need medical care, medical monitoring for life, and their children need it, and they need to be moved to safer ground, relocated permanently. And Norfolk needs to pay for that instead of paying, however many millions of dollars for new parks and to promote tourism. Get these people out of there. They're living on a Superfund site that has not been officially declared one for whatever reason. That's what I'm saying.
And I want to make clear, because it's very important. And this is the same thing that happened in Flint. President Obama issued a state of emergency, not a disaster declaration.
Right.
The same thing has happened here. President Biden has had on his desk now, I believe for 6 months or so, a disaster declaration, and he has not signed it. And they use laws on the books as an excuse, stating we can't issue a disaster declaration for situations like Flint or East Palestine because they're not natural disasters like a tornado or a hurricane. Well, I've spoken with lawyers and legal experts that say they can. They're choosing not to. And the reason a disaster declaration is more important is that's when the federal government takes over. If they issue a disaster declaration, you could send the Army Corps of Engineers, you could send in the best the best chemists and experts known to man. A lot more money can be poured into it. But Biden has not signed a disaster declaration, which he can. So, I'm in agreement with you. Robert, my last question, and then I'll let you guys go. Basically, do you feel that since that flight did not happen in those critical days, we're talking February 5th, February 6th, so 24 hours after the derailment, 48 hours, 72 hours, since that flight did not happen, that it is unknowable the true magnitude and the true levels of chemical exposure that these residents had?
All I can say is that we have no information from 3, 4, and 5, and 6 over the sites. We really can't comment on how bad it was or how good it was because we have no data. Now, we do have 8 minutes worth of data on February 7th, when we also should have about 100 minutes on February 7th, but we have very little data. And the data we have looks okay, but it was way on February 7th.
And sorry, one more. Whose decision was it to only fly on February 7th? Wouldn't you want to continue monitoring after that?
That's because they didn't get the airplane up there until February 6th, and they said February 6th had a weather delay, and so they ended up getting the plane up on February 7th. So,
but whose decision was it to only do February 7th and not continue after that?
Well, that was the program manager's decision of this particular aircraft, or Region 5. It's hard to tell whose decision it was, but the result was that we got, all I can speak about, because I'm a data scientist, all I can speak about is February 7th, 8 minutes worth of data on February 7th. That's all I can tell you about.
And if I have a second, I'd like to point out that the EPA saying that they couldn't fly for the icing conditions in the weather, we've checked into that. That's not the case. And we have witnesses that will, or the meteorology experts that will testify to that. It just is not the case. We don't believe it. And that's what they're coming out with in their statement in response to these whistleblower disclosures.
And Leslie, I want to ask you one more thing, and then I want to say something. I want people to know what they could do. I'm not going to tell you to call your congressman because, they don't care, it seems. From your perspective, because a lot of people that watch, most people are not from East Palestine, but they care. We have people watching from around the world. Mm-hmm. What would the Government Accountability Project want people to do? Do people need to call their congresspeople? Do people need to call the EPA? These things get normalized when people just do nothing.
Right. I would just say that we have an Office of Inspector General request currently in play for to look into all of this and what happened with the Aspect airplane. We do have support from Senator Brown. So far, we're trying to get more support from other congresspeople. Certainly reach out if you feel like that, if you have a connection or you feel like you can be heard through one of your legislative people. But mainly any other people that know anything, if you come forward, we can use your information as sort of teaching us what to look for. We can be anonymous, or if you want to be public, you can be public, but we can explain all those risks and benefits to you. But we certainly need more people like Robert. A lot of the big breaks in these types of situations comes through Freedom of Information Act, but especially through whistleblowers. So anybody who knows anything that could be, even if they not sure it could be helpful, give us a call and reach out to us at Government Accountability Project, which is www.whistleblower.org.
I will put the links under the video. I'll say, because that's a perfect segue to what I wanted to end with. I know, and this is not criticizing anyone, but I know that there are a lot, not one, but a lot of first responders who know things, troubling things, including fire officials. There was firefighters from various fire departments that I know they know things. And I have actually spoken with some of them off the record. And they are afraid to go forward for fear of their jobs or their families. These situations, a lot of people, their threats have been made to them. I know people in other instances that had their brakes cut, crazy things. But the more people that speak out, the more protected you are. And Robert's kind of got the ball rolling but to firefighters that know things that occurred after that derailment that were highly suspect, unusual. If there are officials currently in the EPA that know things, I understand that people need to feed their family and have jobs, but I will say, and I don't think that this is dramatic, I think that sadly this is accurate. We're talking about what could potentially go down as one of the fastest growing cancer clusters in America.
Yeah.
There are already people developing cancers. I can't say directly cause and effect, but you know, there's a man who got double breast cancer 6 months after this. It's pretty unusual in men.
Yeah. That's
so we're talking about something that could potentially go down in American history in a bad way,
Right.
in historic proportions. And if you have knowledge or information that could help hold those accountable, but more importantly, get residents help, you know, I would encourage you to use it. Any other thoughts to that, Leslie?
Yeah, absolutely. And everything that if somebody calls us, they're protected under attorney-client privilege. So we just listen, and we can certainly go to that next step and provide a legal services agreement. But they don't have to come out; they can be anonymous. But it is extremely important, as you guys well know, because it is like the patient bleeding on the table. This is an ongoing public health threat. It's only going to get worse. These people have now been chronically exposed. And if you look at 9/11 and the survivors of 9/11 and how quickly those cancers formed, it was astounding. It breaks from the normal, in 8 to 12 years, we're going to see cancers. No, with 9/11, it was 0.4 years for blood cancer. It was 1 year for childhood cancers. So it's not something that when you're exposed to a synergy of chemicals that scientists don't even understand what it does to the human body, including dioxin, and you're exposed in such a chronic way, the chances of developing chronic illness like cancer quickly are much higher.
Thank you so much, Leslie Pacey from the Government Accountability Project, and Robert Crutel, who was
Retired.
retired, but has blown the whistle on this, and I think hopefully has inspired others who know things to do the same. We will definitely keep in touch.
All right. Thank you so much for your continued coverage. It's so important.